Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Retired Veteran, written by Silver200061. Ever since I could remember things, Mr. Albius has been living in our settlement, in his little cottage at the end of the forest. He was old for a human, and to my 14 years of self, wrinkles were visible on his scarred face. His hair was mostly grey, and kept in a big bushy beard and moustache that most elvish men don't. Yet despite his age, he was still huge and strong, almost a head taller than my father. I often saw him either jogging around the settlement outskirts in the morning, chopping up logs for firewood, or working on his little farm. And sometimes I'd see him sitting at the front door with a pipe in his mouth, huffing and puffing smoke, waving at passing neighbors or curious children, including me, that were lurking around his cottage. I once asked my father about Mr. Albius. Why would an old human live in an elvish settlement instead of the city with his kind? Then my father told me this. Mr. Albius was once a warrior in the human army. During the last demonic incursion, he saved Lord L'Oreal from a host of Cyclops. So, as gratitude, Lord L'Oreal offered Mr. Albius to live here after his retirement, which he accepted. This made me more curious about him. So one day, I mustered all of my courage and friends and visited him. He might have looked scary at first, but was surprisingly friendly a person. Mr. Albius quickly became more and more popular amongst us children, though none of us knew how to properly pronounce his full name. We just called him Big Al or Old Al. His Elvish was mediocre, to say the least, but it was enough to fascinate us with adventures and war stories of his own. The last demon incursion, the Confederate Civil Wars, war against Midland elves, and skirmishes against the Scythian giants. I once threw a bomb, killed 2 orcs with it, and then it exploded. You know, your old Albius was very popular with the ladies. Once there was a dark elf lady I should save this story for when your little ones are older. That giant was quick, but I was quicker. With nothing but a stone, I bashed him right in the head. Last time you said that it was a stick, Mr. Albius. Did I? You must have misheard. I've always said it was a big rock. Have I ever told you children before that I killed a minotaur with my bare hands and teeth? That's right, a 10-foot-tall minotaur with my teeth. Then he showed us his golden tooth that replaced one of the natural ones, which he claimed broke when he ripped out the minotaur's throat. My friends and I enjoyed his stories, and of course the little snacks and gifts he gave us every time we visited, though I personally didn't quite believe it was all true. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Albius was has to have been a great warrior or a soldier, according to the human tongue. After all, he did save Lord L'Oreal, but half of these stories seemed so ridiculously exaggerated. Then the day came when I was proven wrong. It was midnight when it happened. I was awoken by my mother. She had a concerned look on her face and said something was wrong. I quickly put on my shoes and cloak and began hearing shouts and noises that seemed like fighting outside. My mother grabbed her bow and quiver, speaking in a lower voice for me to follow her closely. As she opened the door, a natural orange light pierced through the threshold. It was no moonlight, but a large fire, trees and houses in flames. Now that I peeked over the ledge of the treehouse hanging gangway, I could now see what was causing all of this. Goblins, orcs, and demonic beastlings were rampaging through the streets and houses. Most of our garrisons, including my father, was out for goblin purging miles away, and would take some time for them to return, even for elvish footing. Afterwards, I was told this was a trick of the enemy to lure our strongest warriors away so our defense was weak. Then, under the cover of a goblin shaman dark magic, they snuck in. Though most of us elves knew how to fight, even civilians, due to our mandatory combat training since childhood, The attack was too subtle for us to organize any proper defense. It was everyone for themselves, fighting at the doorsteps or shooting from the rooftops, hoping to stem the rampaging horde and buy time for the warriors to return. Mother held my hands, and we began moving towards the garrison fortress, which had the highest chance of any kind of organized defense, and most likely the safest place in the whole settlement. On our way, we were joined by a few of our neighbors, and had to fight through a few small packs of spider-riding goblins that got in our way, but most of them were dealt with swiftly. The majority of the invaders must have been distracted by a more populated market center. But once we hit the main road, the situation became worse. Many besides us had the same idea of seeking refuge in the fortress. The larger column drew more attention, and more enemy came rushing our way. Our progress became slower, as we had to turn back and fight the pursuing waves of orcs, beastlings, and goblins. The situation was getting more and more desperate. More and more people were getting wounded and even killed during the fighting. Mother suffered a deep cut to her left arm, rendering her unable to use a bow anymore. The worst came when a minotaur smashed through a building from our right, cutting right into the crowd. An orderly fighting withdrawal degraded into a panic retreat. Then my hands were separated from Mother's, thrown into the ground by a shockwave of an exploding fireball cast by a goblin shaman. When I regained consciousness, my head was spinning and my vision was blurry. It took an effort to push myself up. My ears rang, and the chaos around me became a muffled background. Mother was laying a few feet away from me, completely still. I stumbled towards her, and dread began to creep up my chest. I called out for Mother and shook her, but she was not responding. I shook again, shouting, "Mother!" louder this time. Tears began to uncontrollably run down my face as I felt utterly helpless, frustrated. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over me. I turned and saw the most horrific sight of my life. An orc, armored in crude but thick metal plates, armed with a bloody axe and saliva dripping from his tusks. It laughed and slowly raised its axe as if it was savoring this moment. My legs became unresponsive with fear, even when my mind was screaming, "Run! Get up and run!" The axe raised to its highest point. The orc's muscular arm bulged as he prepared to swing. Then its head exploded in a mist of red and dark skin, followed by a loud bang as if a thunderclap during a storm. A big figure approached from the corner of my teared eyes and knelt beside me. It was Mr. Albius holding a boomstick. He had donned an outfit that I had never seen before, a white jacket and trousers, with blue collars and long sleeves, shoulders decorated in red epaulets, and a big bearskin hat on the top of his head. Every brass button was decorated plate, or polished to a shiny glim. "Are you all right, little one?" he said. Relief sets in, and my tears erupted into a ball, unable to formulate a coherent sentence. All I could mutter out between my sobs was, "Mother." Mr. Albius checked her Mother, pulling his finger in front of her Mother's nose and her neck, and let out a sigh of relief. "She's alive, little one, just hurt. Let's get her into somewhere safe and someone who could treat her, eh?" With a grunt, he lifted my Mother with one arm. I nodded, trying my best to stop sobbing, and wiped away the tears from my face, then helped Mr. Albius shoulder some of the weight. Our progress wasn't easy. Oftentimes, I had to carry Mother on my back as Mr. Albius turned to fight the approaching beastlings, orcs, and goblins. He fought with a sense of efficiency and years of experience. He worked the bolt of his boomstick, or as he told me, a chatelaine rifle, in a fluid motion. Pull, insert paper cartridge from his pocket, push, aim, then a large bang. With every shot, either a head exploded, limbs were torn off, or a chest burst open. When Mr. Albion did not have time to reload, he resulted in using the short spike attached to the end of his rifle, or the thick wooden stock, parrying blows very precisely, as if he was one of those spear masters, then retaliated with a perfect thrust or a skull-crushing smash with his stock. Mr. Albius also fought with a bad mouth, Though I picked up some of the naughty words, I've never heard a man swear so much, and with such toxicity. Sometimes in his wonky elvish, sometimes in human tongue, mostly involving genitals and sexual intercourse and a fixation on one's mother. Such as, "Eat us, you dung-eating lowlife," and the most memorable one being, "Your mother's a whore and she stinks like elderberries." Eventually, we could see the fortress itself, but we were too late. The guards were urging the last remaining people in, and the drawbridge was about to be lifted as the main horde was about to arrive any second now. "Excuse me," said Mr. Albius. Before I could ask for what, he strapped his rifle to his back, then lifted me on his left shoulder, while Mother was on his right. And then he sprinted. Actually, no. He charged. He ran faster than any horse I've seen. He must have covered at least 100 yards within 20 seconds. "Wait!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. A few guards heard and turned around, but the drawbridge was already lifting. Some called to the gatehouse to stop, but I was sure that they were not going to risk it for us, as the horde was right behind us. Mr. Albius probably knew this as well, but he didn't stop. He kept the pace and shouting again, louder this time, when he was about to reach the fortress moat. "Catch them!" Before I could process what he meant, I was propelled into the air and arched over the drawbridge, then followed by my mother. We were both caught and cushioned by the guards. I recovered immediately, crawled up to the already half-lifted drawbridge, ignoring the guards' words for me to come back. Mr. Albius was still out there. I reached the edge and called for him, extending my hand as if he could jump all the way over the moat. But he was exhausted, panting, bent down with his hands on his knees. He heard my voice and looked up, waved at me, and smiled as if he was just sitting on a rocking chair outside of his doorway during a casual afternoon. I turned back to the guards behind me. "We can't just leave him out there. Help him. Throw him a rope or anything." They all showed bitter expressions, shaking their heads. The drawbridge was heavily inclined. I clung to the edge, reluctant to let go, and started crying again. "It's okay, little one," Mr. Albius shouted, as if to comfort me. "It's all right. Don't worry about me." But the horde was now very close, just a couple 100 yards beyond the moat, and moving slowly in formation. "Here, take this." He ripped something off his collar and threw it to me. I caught it with one hand, but my other lost its grip, and I slid down the almost shut drawbridge. "Keep it safe for me." His shouting voice came beyond the gates. I looked down. It was a piece of gold-decorated metal plate, shaped into a 5-cornered star. The sword symbol of the John Tamar Republic was embossed in the center. I shrugged off the hands of the guards and ran up to the walls. I must see what was going on beyond the gates. I squeezed past the armed men and made it to the ramparts. Mr. Albius stood right in the middle of our gates, back towards us, rifle rested on his hips, like a sharp spike slightly raised and pointed at the enemy. The horde of demonic creatures stopped right outside of our arrow range, but not that they feared our archers. Something was commanding them to halt. A minotaur, an almost 10 feet tall monstrous creature, with horns so big and muscles so thick as if he could tear open the stone walls with his bare hands. In his hand, a mighty sword that radiated a hellish aura. It roared as if to initiate a single combat challenge. Mr. Albius replied with a voice that matched the minotaur. "I am Albius de Pontois of the Jantima Old Guard, and you shall not pass this gate as long as I draw breath." Then he pointed his rifle like a spear with one hand at the hulking minotaur. "I've been killing your kind since I was 16. I will gladly shove you back to the hellhole you shat out of." The both roared almost simultaneously and charged. The Minotaur with his blade, and Mr. Albius with his bayonet-fixed rifle. The Minotaur was indeed powerful. His strength and speed were enhanced by the Demon Lord's dark sorcery, and every swing and smash could have cleaved through a war chariot in one blow. Although Mr. Albius could not compete in raw strength, he matched the Minotaur with his skill, experience, and agility. Every strike was either dodged or parried with such precision that the massive blade missed by a hair. A small step or a well-timed deflection on that flat of the sword made it miss its mark. Then, with every chance, he countered, stabbing his sword arm, armor joints, or legs. Sometimes the Minotaur was able to block and step away. But eventually, Mr. Albius drew first blood, wounding the beast's sword hand and forcing him to drop the blade. At first, most of the elves on the ramparts thought Mr. Albius was going to die, chopped to pieces in a few seconds. Then more of us began to cheer him on. "Big Al! Big Al! Big Al!" I started shouting loudest, hoping that he could hear me and that it could help him win the fight. But I almost forgot that he was already tired, his stamina drained from the continued fighting, not to mention his age. I could start to see the fatigue setting in, his deflecting parry becoming less and less precise, the dodge slower. He began to bleed as well. A long, low, swiping strike came. This time, Mr. Albius couldn't jump out of the way and was forced to block it. The great claw cracked his rifle and sent him flying to the side. He rolled a few times on the ground and stopped, and struggled to recover from it, his shaky arms and legs straining to lift himself. The cheering died. Many gasped or clenched their fists, thinking, "This is it. Old Albius is no more." But I refused to believe that. I gathered my breath and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Mr. Albius!" He must have heard it, and as if he drank a strength potion, with a great cry, he lifted himself up from the floor and picked his bearskin hat and wore it on the top of his head again. The Minotaur let out a sound similar to a laugh, as if the fight was too short, it would have been boring. It charged with its full speed again, claws formed into fists. Mr. Albius ducked and weaved, dodging the hail of punches and swings. He drew his short sword as one strike barely missed and caught the edge of his head. He jumped in between the arms, then leapt, plunging the blade up into the Minotaur's unarmored throat. The sharp blade penetrated deep and sank into the throat. The Minotaur gave a frantic swing and swept Mr. Albius off itself. Mr. Albius was thrown off to the side again, but this time he got up quicker. But the short sword in his hand disappeared. It must have slipped due to the impact. He looked around and picked up a piece of rock, then limped towards the Minotaur, now choking on its own blood and half kneeling on the ground, attempting to stop the bleeding with its big claws with no effect. The Minotaur saw Mr. Albius coming and swung out one of its arms to keep him away, while the other instinctively remained on his wound. Mr. Albius ducked under it and leapt forward with a bone-shattering sound, smashed the rock directly on the face of the Minotaur. It was thrown to its back, and Mr. Albius climbed on top and began to smash down with both hands. With each strike he shouted, "I'm on my fucking vacation!" The rock broke into two in his hands, and he looked at it with disappointment as the Minotaur was still alive, though barely. His claws still weakly pushed against Mr. Albius. Then, a sight that I would never forget. The tales were true. In the most savage way, Mr. Albius opened his mouth and bit deep into the Minotaur's throat, and the sharp claws clawed at Mr. Albius's back, with that last attempt to fight back. Then, with a swing of his head, Mr. Albius ripped the throat out of the Minotaur, blood splattering on the white and blue uniform. He spat chunks of flesh out. Now the Minotaur's arms were completely motionless. Mr. Albius got off the corpse and turned towards the horde of orcs, goblins, and beastlings, mouth and hands still covered in Minotaur blood. "Who's next?" he shouted, and the formation lines backed up a little. He shouted again, "Who's next?" With this, the hordes of demonic creatures slowly wavered, then turned around and started to retreat. The ramparts erupted in cheers and praises, all shouting his name. Once the guards confirmed the enemies were truly gone, the drawbridge was lowered, and I was the first to run out to Mr. Albius, now laying on the ground. I knelt down beside him, worried that he would succumb to his wounds. "Mr. Albius?" I asked. He opened his eyes, then looked towards me. "Ah, hello there, little one." He was utterly exhausted. Another new addition to his collection of facial scars, and half of his right ear was missing. The once beautiful uniform was ripped in many places, and now soaked in blood, either of the Minotaur or of his own. "I'm too old for this shit," he said, then smiled. The golden tooth was missing. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrakal, Dragzoon WRE, Holly Sister, Ambrose Cattell, and Quantum Wednesday. Thank you very much.